Dzień dobry, witam serdecznie w programie English Breakfast Extra. Nasza maszyna produkcyjna nie zatrzymuje się ani na moment. Kolejny bardzo miły i przede wszystkim bardzo wartościowy gość, a tym gościem jest Michael COX, autor takiej oto książki. Polski tytuł Premier League. Już nic bardziej z Premier League nie może się kojarzyć, więc ten zabieg wydawnictwa Sine Qua Non jest bardzo dobry. W oryginale książka nosi tytuł The Mixer i dzisiaj porozmawiamy sobie, no myślę, że przede wszystkim o ewolucji Premier League, bo o tym, przynajmniej dla mnie w największej mierze jest ta książka. Michael, nice to meet you, nice to have you here. Thank you for coming to my little show. And my first question is, what's the biggest difference for you between the beginning of Premier League, early 90s, and everything what we can see now in England, in the top division in England?
Well, first, thank you very much for inviting me on.
You're welcome.
Thank you. The main difference is the number of foreign players. I mean, it's a very basic thing, but the first day of the Premier League, August 15th, 1992, there were 22 teams in the league at that point, and between them, they had 11 players starting. So 11 from 22 teams. And then obviously things changed.
And not in the one team.
Not in the one team, exactly. And then 1995 was the Bosman ruling. You no longer had to have only 3 players in your team, 3 foreign players in your team, and you could have as many as you wanted. And then by 1999, Chelsea, we say Boxing Day, the day after Christmas Day, fielded an entire team of 11 players. So in the space of 7 years, you went from 11 foreign players in the entire league to 11 foreign players in just one team. And obviously that brings different styles, different ways of playing the game. English football was quite simple, I think. It was broadly 4-4-2. We played big strikers, we got the ball wide, we crossed it. And then we had this incredible wave of foreign players coming in who just revolutionised the game. And the same thing has happened since with managers. I mean, I think there's maybe 5 English managers out of the 20 in the top flight. In 1992, there was one foreign manager.
It was Josef Węglarz
yes.
in Aston Villa, and
exactly.
It wasn't good for Aston Villa because they were like a second in the league, and the next season they were fighting against relegation. So and he said one really interesting thing, and it's also important to remind that he was Slovakian. Mm-hmm. He is Slovakian, and it was like, I have never seen in my life somebody who is drinking so much beer, and it was in England, and it's also the big change in Premier League, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the early days of the Premier League, there wasn't much knowledge about nutrition and diet, and it was the common thing to go out and drink a lot of beer. Maybe after Tuesday, at Arsenal famously, they had the Tuesday club because they had Wednesday off, so they would go to the pub and drink 9 or 10 pints of beer. So in terms of fitness, there's been a big evolution since 1992.
When I was reading your book, for me it's a book about how individualities they are changing whole league. It's about Cantona. It's about players and also managers. And I'd like to ask you the most important question: who is the best manager in Premier League history, and why it's Arsene Wenger in your opinion?
Okay. Well, I mean, I think in terms of the impact he had, it probably is Wenger. I mean, he came in at a time when there was only one other foreign manager, and that was Ruud Gullit, who we knew he was a big player. You know, he played for Chelsea, he rose to become manager. Whereas Wenger just came from Japan, and even now, getting a manager in from Japan would seem crazy, really, because it's such a step up. But then no one really knew his name. I mean, I didn't know the name of Arsene Wenger. I know he'd achieved things with Monaco, but he was a complete outsider. And I think in terms of his recruitment of foreign players, as we've discussed, in terms of the diet, as we've discussed, but also in terms of playing attacking football and not just getting the ball wide and crossing, playing with quick strikers. Bergkamp was already there, but I think he only really started to play well when Wenger came in. So, he was maybe not the most successful manager in terms of league titles, but probably the one who came in and just had an immediate impact more than anyone else.
It's not only about tactics, what can the front page suggest with those arrows and the pitch. It's not only about tactics and strategies. It's also about people, and there are some really nice stories.
Mm-hmm.
My favorite one is about Overmars and Anelka in Arsene Wenger's room at Highbury. Can you remind it?
Yeah, so this is when Anelka was, of course, very young. He'd come to Arsenal at 18. He didn't speak any English. He was very isolated within the team. You know, he didn't really talk to anyone. Well, he couldn't because he didn't speak English. And he also had a problem with Mark Overmars. He said Mark Overmars only passed to Dennis Bergkamp and not to him because they were Dutch international colleagues. And Wenger found out about this problem, so got them together in his office. And he asked Anelka to say what his problem with Overmars was, and Anelka wasn't very complimentary. But of course he spoke only in French. And then he asked Overmars what his problem was, and Overmars basically said he didn't like Anelka and he didn't want to pass to him. But because Anelka didn't speak any English and Overmars didn't speak any French, Wenger basically lied to them both. And he said to Overmars, okay, Anelka says he doesn't have a problem with you anymore. And he said to Anelka, yeah, Overmars is saying that he's going to pass you the ball more. Actually, nothing of the sort had happened. But I guess that's one of those classic early Premier League kind of language differences, cultural differences. But I didn't know Wenger was that cunning and that sly, but I'm impressed he managed to sort out that situation.
Because he was smart. He wasn't the kind of manager who is screaming to the face at players in the dressing room. He's aggressive, because there were a lot of managers working in this style.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that traditionally in English football, the manager would just shout at players at half-time. You know, there's a couple of famous documentaries in England of kind of lower league managers where they go into the dressing room at half-time and it's just, you know, the manager throws things, the manager swears, the manager doesn't say anything about the tactics. And then Wenger was different because he demanded a period of silence at half-time. They'd just sit and kind of reflect on their first half performance, which in English football is just literally a foreign concept. And I think Wenger changed attitudes a lot in terms of, you know, what football could be. He talked about football, you know, he wanted Arsenal to play football so good it became an art, which was the kind of thing that, you know, 5 years beforehand, you couldn't really imagine anyone saying that. And I don't think an English manager would have got away with that. But I think with Wenger, because he was so different, because he was foreign, because he was, you know, people thought he was a professor rather than a kind of footballer. People didn't see him as an ex-footballer. He could say these things and people would kind of almost take notice, you know, because it was so different, it was so left field. So, yeah, I think before and after Wenger was probably the biggest change in English football.
He stayed really long with Arsenal. Were you surprised it's so long?
Yes, I was surprised, but I think he found himself in a funny kind of position at Arsenal where he almost became bigger than the board and bigger than the club. And
so he couldn't be fired?
To a certain extent. I mean, I think that was the perception for a while. In the end, you know, he obviously was moved aside. I think it was very much a decision from the board rather than him. But for years, he just became part of the furniture, as we say, at Arsenal, and did so much. I mean, not just in the footballing side. When Arsenal moved to the new stadium, he took a very hands-on role in the financing of it, in terms of the design of the stadium. He designed the shape of the dressing rooms, so he wanted the home dressing room to be like a horseshoe shape, so he could speak to the players properly. The away dressing room was a square because he thought that was awkward, and it was all these kind of areas of the club he was getting involved in. Which is fantastic and incredible that he has that kind of financial knowledge and interest in the architecture. But also
it was too much, probably.
Exactly, but at the same time, Arsenal were not doing the right things on the pitch, and it was almost like Wenger was becoming a director of football or something rather than a first-team coach. And I think already this season we've seen under Emery, Arsenal kind of more reactive. They do things in a different way. The pressing high up the pitch, I think, has been more aggressive, more intelligent. So Wenger's journey was very interesting. He became, you know, as I say, more than a manager, I would say.
How do you think, why he couldn't why he couldn't invent something new like he did it before?
Well, I think really when you look through the history of Premier League, there's not that managers who have managed to reinvent themselves. Often you see a manager come over with one specific idea and it lasts a couple of seasons and then everyone else starts to copy it. You know, we saw with Conte at Chelsea. And I think Conte is a brilliant manager. I think what he's done at Juventus and Chelsea is incredible. But he came in and started quite poorly, first 5 or 6 games, and then moved to the 3-4-3 system. And for half a season, teams just didn't know how to cope. And then even in the end of the title-winning season, you saw teams were starting to figure it out. Obviously, Arsenal moved to 3-4-3, beat Chelsea in the cup final, and it was almost like Conte couldn't reinvent himself. And I think we've seen that a lot, whether it's been Jose Mourinho, Conte, with Wenger, of course. The exception, I think, is Sir Alex Ferguson, who probably wasn't, he didn't invent anything himself, but was always kind of moved with the times. And everyone else has found themselves kind of, they find their inventions copied. And it's difficult to evolve, it seems, yeah.
You know what is funny for me, because you write in your book like about the tactics, like 1-3-5-2, and Conte won a title with Chelsea, but you wrote in your book that it was the most boring tactics, especially when two teams were in this strategy.
I mean, certainly in the 90s.
So I mean, football is like a big circle. It's so, after 10 years, it's the same what was before.
I mean, to a certain extent. I think the interesting thing with the 3-4-3 was you got the two players in wider positions and they could combine. Whereas, like what you mentioned, I say, is in the 1990s when you had 2 3-5-2s against each other, you had 3 versus 2 at the back for both teams, and then just the wing backs would kind of chase each other up and down the touchlines. He didn't really have any movement, he didn't have any interplay down the flanks. And I think that's why the 3-4-3 was a bit different, because you had with Chelsea you had Hazard coming in and Alonso overlapping, and that worked really well. But I think tactical variety is the most important thing. I think when you get 2 systems that are the same against each other, it's not so interesting. But when you have 2 different styles, I think that's when it becomes a tactically interesting game.
Can you watch the game normally, like normal people, or you are just analyzing tactics and movements, passing, and all this stuff which normal person maybe can't see in the game?
Yeah, I've kind of learned to switch off when necessary.
But your favorite club is in 7th League, yeah? You
Exactly.
told me before, so
yeah,
you don't have to be nervous during the game.
Exactly, and I can watch them and it's the 7th division.
There is no tactics.
There's no tactics,
exactly.
exactly. It's just kick it long and chase it. So,
it's some Allardyce tactics.
Pretty much, yeah. So that's my pure enjoyment with football, and Premier League games I tend to watch in a little bit more of an analytical way, I suppose, yeah.
Do you think a manager like Sam Allardyce has a future in Premier League, or it's finished with Guardiola, Klopp, Sarri and all those big names?
I mean, I think he still has a future in terms of taking over teams that are threatened from relegation and guiding them to
like a fireman,
survival.
yeah?
Pretty much, yeah. He did a great job with Palace. Everton, I think Everton would have got out of trouble last year anyway, but even then they rose up through the table. So, I mean, Allardyce has always said that he could do a big job if he's given it. He was given the England job, and obviously it only lasted 1 game, so we never really got to see. And I don't think he'll ever manage a club as big as Everton again. I think that was probably the end for him in terms of people saying he could do it at a bigger club. So I think his options will be the bottom half teams, but even some of them have good managers, that want to play good football. You look at Fulham with Jokanovic. They're not going to go for Allardyce if they find themselves in trouble. The same for Wolves. So it's tough to know really where the next job will come, but maybe it'll be abroad. I think he's, he was obviously interested in the international job when he managed England, and maybe he'll work abroad or do something different. But yeah, if a big club or if a medium-sized club starts struggling, then I think Allardyce remains the #1 manager to go to.
What was the main driver to write this kind of book for you? What was the main idea? Can you tell us more about it?
I mean, really, because no one had written about the Premier League as a kind of history. It'd been 25 years when I wrote it, 26 now, and there'd been a few books in England on the history and the development of the Premier League, but it was always on the business terms, so the owners and the finances and the television rights, which obviously is a huge deal, literally a huge deal. But for me, the interesting thing is on the pitch and what happens on the pitch. And it's been such an evolution from the start in terms of the early 90s and the way matches were played to the way that they're played now. And no one had really charted that. So just addressing that lack of a book in the market, I guess, was the key factor.
Was the long process? I mean, research and writing.
The research was long. I mean, yeah, particularly the early 90s.
So sitting in library,
yeah,
stuff like this. Yeah?
Exactly. I kind of came up with the idea, but I didn't realise that I hadn't thought about the 25th anniversary. So the publishers said, "Oh, it'd be good to do it for the 25th anniversary." So that was only a year later. So it was done over the course of a year, which was probably a little bit of a tight squeeze, but I think it worked out okay in the end. Yeah.
What I like in your book is sometimes it's a way of your thinking. I will give you an example. It's with Cantona, because you pointed that Cantona was the great player, but also he did something special for Premier League. So he made it loud, as I can say, with kicking the Crystal Palace fan. And it was everywhere in Australia, Asia, America, like 30 pages of the Sun daily.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's really important suggestion, I think.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, that's almost a bit of a personal experience, because I have a lot of family in New Zealand, so I was on holiday in New Zealand, and this was before the internet. My family didn't have any channels which showed the Premier League, so I didn't hear anything about I was there for a month. I didn't hear anything about the Premier League. I heard like maybe 1 or 2 results. And then I was watching the news, 9 o'clock news in New Zealand, and the first story on the news is Cantona kicking the fan. And to me that felt like a big moment, because it was the Premier League making stories, you know, making headlines elsewhere. And of course it was, you know, it was a pretty bad act. He was banned for 6 months, I think.
Yeah.
But this was the most interesting character. It was the best player in English football, and it was the most interesting character in English football. And everyone who knew nothing about the Premier League was introduced to this kind of footballer who fancied himself as a philosopher, who talked about art and films and literature. And it just felt like something different, something new. And so, yeah, that moment, I think, was massive for the Premier League. Not just for the bad reasons of, you know, a player out of control and being banned for 6 months, but it just introduced them to someone fascinating. I still think the most interesting and most revolutionary player in the Premier League, Eric Cantona.
So do you think he was the best player ever in Premier League, or you maybe have another favourite one?
I don't think he was, actually. And I think the difference is the standard of the Premier League at that point wasn't great. You know, it wasn't as good as it was when Thierry Henry came and Cristiano Ronaldo came. So I think it was easier, in a certain sense, for Cantona to be a great player. I mean, I think the best Premier League player for me is Thierry Henry. I think what he did over a consistent period, the goals he scored, the fact he took Arsenal to the next level, and the fact he mixed kind of athleticism with artistry. You know, he was a beautiful player to watch, but also physically fantastic. I don't think anyone has quite matched that. I think when you compare him to Ronaldo, there was almost 2 different Ronaldos. There was the Ronaldo at first, where he was doing the trickery and he was showing off, and there was Ronaldo later, where he became a machine, you know, an incredible physical player. But I think he kind of lost he wasn't as much of an entertainer, whereas I think Henry always mixed both of them. And I think when you look at his goal-scoring figures, you know, 4 years out of 5 he won the Golden Boot. The other year he lost by 1 goal, I think, to Van Nistelrooy, and yet that was the season where he got 20 assists, and Van Nistelrooy got like 5 assists. And so even when he wasn't scoring goals, he was still the most creative player in the league. So I'd always say Henry is the best Premier League player.
So he's gonna probably be a part of your team, because I'm asking my guests for 4 of a kind. So it's like 4 aces, 1 position, 1 player. So keeper, defender, midfielder, and a striker forward, as you wish. So Thierry Henry, it's in the team, as I understand.
Of course, yeah.
And a goalkeeper. It's gonna be probably Peter Schmeichel, or not.
It's a tough one. I think De Gea has probably got to a higher level than Schmeichel. And I think you could say the same about Petr Cech when he was at his peak at Chelsea as well. again, the interesting thing with Schmeichel was, I think he was quite revolutionary in English football, particularly with his distribution. You know, he came in 1992 when it was just after the back pass law, and so goalkeepers had to be more of a footballer. They had to use their feet, and Schmeichel did that. But I think his distribution was more about his arms. You know, he assisted with like 70-yard throws, which we hadn't really seen before in English football.
Or go into the penalty area of the opponent.
Exactly,
trying
yeah.
to score a goal.
Yeah, which we kind of take for granted now. It happens quite a lot, but I remember when Schmeichel first came out for a corner, I hadn't seen that before, genuinely. And I think it just, and of course he scored in a UEFA Cup game against a Russian team, Rota Volgograd. But I think that kind of, it kind of showed that a goalkeeper could be more than just a goalkeeper. And I think that was really, really important. But I think in terms of the actual level keepers got to, Cech was incredible his first couple of seasons, really, really top, just made incredible saves. I think De Gea, after a bit of a slow start, now has been 4 or 5 years. He's been Manchester United's best player every season, the best goalkeeper in the league every season. So
You can take only one.
I'd probably take De Gea.
De Gea.
Now, yeah.
So you are like Stan Collymore. He's all the same.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
He was comparing De Gea with Schmeichel, but Schmeichel has won more trophies with United, of course.
Exactly, yeah, and went out.
And it's also important.
Yeah, and I mean his last game for United was winning the Champions League, so that's pretty tough to beat. Yeah.
Defender?
One defender. That's a tough one, defenders, because there's a few candidates over the years, but I think Rio Ferdinand was probably the best, and I think we kind of take it for granted now. But when Rio Ferdinand was coming through, he was seen as really different because he was not a centre back, you know, coming through the ranks. He was a midfielder, and he was considered very good on the ball, which maybe you don't think of Ferdinand as being a great footballing defender. But I think that shows the journey in terms of how defenders had to be good on the ball. And by the end of his career, all centre-backs were as comfortable on the ball as Ferdinand. But I think his calmness was really interesting. He kind of changed perceptions in England. In England, the centre-backs were always, you know, like a Tony Adams figure or a John Terry figure, like tall, strong, very hard. They were both good footballers as well. But Ferdinand was, he did things in a more composed way. You know, he went through, I think, something like 70 games without getting booked, which just shows you he didn't need to foul players. He was about intelligence. He was about reading the game, and I think that defenders that have come through in the last few years in England have they've seen Ferdinand more than someone like John Terry as their template.
It wasn't easy to change the game because you write about it also in your book. A situation that players couldn't pass the ball to the keeper, and it has changed a lot also in England, especially for Liverpool, as you noticed.
Yes, I mean Liverpool dominated the 70s and 80s, and in England they were renowned for kind of taking advantage of the lack of back pass laws. So when they were winning, famously they just pass the ball around the back, knock it back to the goalkeeper, the keeper would pick it up.
Stealing some time.
Yes, exactly.
Or a lot of time.
And to be fair, I don't know whether Liverpool did that more than most teams or whether it was just because they were winning and so they did it more naturally because they were winning. But it was notable that, yeah, they suffered after the back pass change. I mean, their decline probably happened the year before. I think they finished 6th in the last season before the Premier League and 6th in the first Premier League season. But there are other examples as well. I mean, Leeds won the title the last year before the Premier League and then finished, I think, 17th. Yeah. In the first Premier League season, and all the players say the fact that we couldn't pass back to John Lukic was the main reason. So it did change the game. And Arsenal as well. Arsenal, I think they scored the most goals in the season just before the Premier League, and then the fewest goals in the first season in the Premier League. So that's a massive change, and again, they blamed it on the back pass. So that one simple rule that happened to just coincide with the start of the Premier League, I think was a massive change to football across Europe, of course, not just in the Premier League.
So you have De Gea in your team and Rio Ferdinand.
Rio Ferdinand.
And Thierry Henry as a midfielder or as a forward?
I think he has to be as a forward, yeah.
So you have one more place.
One more place.
For midfielder.
For the midfielder, I'd go for Steven Gerrard. And I mean, it's maybe funny to talk about Gerrard in a book about tactics because a lot of people say that he didn't have that tactical discipline. And I don't think it was a great strength of his, but I think he had everything else. I think he was a really good player. You look at what he could do in a technical sense. He could pass, he could score goals, he was a great tackler, he could cross. He was a leader, he led by example, he was good in the air. And I don't think people should be too critical of him for his lack of tactical intelligence. Because I think if he'd gone to Chelsea in 2005, when he very nearly did, he would have won league titles and people wouldn't have mentioned that. And I think the fact that what he did, you know, he stayed almost his whole career with Liverpool, his whole career in English football, is something we don't see that much anymore.
One-man club, yeah.
One club man, exactly.
One
Obviously, he
club man.
played for LA for 2 seasons, but I think we consider him a one club man. And some individual performances of his were really spectacular. And it's become the done thing to kind of mock him for not winning a league title. And I think that will obviously always hang over him. But again, it's just the price to pay for his loyalty. And, you know, we admire other players in England for their loyalty. Matt Letizia, for example, famous player in the 90s who stayed at Southampton his whole career. And he's always praised for his loyalty, whereas Gerrard is sometimes criticised. But I'd go for Gerrard as the most complete midfielder. It's close between him and Lampard, certainly. But I think
This is my favourite player.
Lampard?
Yeah.
I mean,
because
I think
he's really smart and
yeah,
he scored a lot of goals. I love the story about him running in the park and doing sliding tackles.
exactly. Yeah,
with no opponent and no ball.
No opponent.
It's really funny.
Just practicing the technique of sliding. Yeah, I mean, Lampard, I think, is the player who got the most out of his talent. I mean, you listen to people talk about him when he was a young player at West Ham, and people would say Joe Cole's a great player, Michael Carrick, Rio Ferdinand's a great player, Jermaine Defoe.
And Frank Lampard, Redknapp is his uncle, so
exactly.
Maybe he's playing only because of it.
Exactly. So they talked about favouritism. Yeah, Redknapp was his uncle. His dad was assistant manager, and he had a great introduction into football because of those reasons. But
he's from football family.
Yeah.
His father played for West Ham like 660 times probably, yeah?
Something ridiculous, yeah. He was a left back. I think he played for England once, his dad. So he had this great upbringing.
Like Bobby Moore was their guest.
Yeah, I think his dad was good friends with Bobby Moore. So Bobby Moore obviously won the World Cup as England captain, would be having Sunday lunch with the Lampards.
And tea.
Exactly. And of course, his cousin was Jamie Redknapp. So he had, I think Jamie Redknapp was maybe 4 years older than him.
Yeah, and they played together in a midfield in national team.
Yeah, I think it was Lampard's debut actually.
Yeah.
So he had this great upbringing, you know. His dad's the assistant manager, his uncle is the manager. He gets to play for the first time for England alongside his cousin. But of course became a bigger player than all of them. You know, he Chelsea's record goal scorer, 100 England caps, lifted the European Cup as captain because John Terry was suspended. And I think probably one of the most respected players in England as well. He's a manager now. He's just starting out at Derby, but he's been a pundit for the past couple of years. And I think he's an intelligent guy. You know, he went to. He's unusual in England in going to, got a good school, had a good education. And I think he speaks about the game in a different way to most ex-players in England.
What was wrong with so-called golden generation in England? I mean national team with Gerrard, Scholes, Lampard, Terry. They were struggling during World Cups or European Championships.
Yeah, it was a big problem, and I think the problem was a tactical problem, really. I mean, England was stuck between playing the old school kind of 4-4-2 way, which was what David Beckham wanted because he needed to be wide and cross, and what Michael Owen wanted because he had to play off a kind of bigger forward. But then Gerrard and Lampard were excelling, you know, at club level in 3-man midfields. And you look back to the Ballon d'Or voting 2005, Ronaldinho wins. Obviously, Ronaldinho was the best player. And then second was Lampard and third was Gerrard. Or maybe the other way around, actually. No, Lampard was second, yeah. And we couldn't fit these guys into the team because they played generally, for the national team, they played 4-4-2. And we had this situation where they didn't really know what their roles were. Lampard was going forward and Gerrard was dropping back or vice versa. And, you know, the manager was Eriksson at the time and took him a long time to really make a decisive change a system that accommodated them both. So, you know, the players themselves talk about other problems. They talk about players from teams not getting on, Chelsea against Liverpool and Manchester United, but I'm not sure how much that is a factor. When you look at Spain and the success they had, and they had the Barcelona-Real Madrid rivalry, I think it was more about tactics and more about, we didn't really know whether we were going for Beckham and Owen and their system or Gerrard and Lampard, and we kind of did neither. So, yeah, that generation should have done a lot more. Got to 3 quarter-finals, and we did lose on penalties in 2 of them, 2004, 2006 to Portugal. So if we'd gone through on penalties, you never know. But I think it showed that England was behind the other countries tactically, because obviously the clubs these players were playing for was managed by Benitez, Mourinho, who were winning things in Europe. And I think Eriksen was probably a little bit behind the times.
Now you don't have so many talented players, but you have a good World Cup behind you. It's being in a top 4 in the world, even if some opponents were totally crap on the road to this 4. It's really big achievement, I think.
Yeah, I mean it's.
So what's happened?
Yeah, well, it took everyone by surprise, to be honest. I mean, we were in after the Euros, we were in a complete state of crisis. We lost to Iceland, and Iceland are okay, but you know, to lose to them was a real low moment for us, considering the population size. They had players playing in the Championship. I mean, it was incredible loss. And then we appoint Allardyce, and that was widely seen as a bit of a negative. And Allardyce gets sacked for, you know, these...
He won one game
he won
Slovakia.
Yeah, 100% record, always. And
the best manager in England history.
Exactly, in one sense, yeah. So he got sacked, and then Southgate came in, and obviously Southgate was remembered in England for missing the crucial penalty in '96. His only managerial experience had been with Middlesbrough, where they got relegated. He'd done a good job as the under-21 coach, but no one really had any belief in him or the team to do anything.
So and, maybe it was better for him.
For Southgate?
Yeah.
Well, the low expectations, you mean?
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think that was important. And I think what Southgate did was not really tactical. It was more about the kind of overall sense of English football, in terms of the fact he took a chance on young players who weren't getting chances for their club teams. He speaks in a very kind of impressive way, Southgate. Again, he doesn't sound like a footballer. He sounds like someone who thinks about things. He's intelligent. He connects with people, I think, and I think that was the most important thing. I think the players were more relaxed, and there was also a big change in the way that the players kind of dealt with the media. I think in English football, they were happier to do interviews. They were happier to talk. They were happier to talk about themselves and you know, personal problems they had sometimes. For example, Danny Rose, I think, you know, did an interview last year or earlier this year where he was talking about, you know, he'd had some kind of anxiety problems or depression problems, and it just created this kind of atmosphere of openness. And I think that was really the biggest change in English football.
Yeah, you can feel it, especially when you looked to the tabloids in England. There wasn't like smashing players all the time like it was before in history. Exactly.
And when you listen to players who played for England in the golden generation 10, 15 years ago, and they'd say that, you know, midway through matches when they were losing, they'd be fearing, you know, the press reaction when they got home. And I don't think those players have the players now have any reason to think that. I think there's a more supportive environment. And just being in, you know, I was in London for the World Cup. I wasn't out in Russia, and there was a really big atmosphere. You know, it was something that I haven't experienced for 20 years. You know, people who weren't into football getting into football, and there was a big kind of camaraderie and a big push for the national team. And tactically, I think England actually in the end got a lot of things wrong, and to lose to Croatia in the semi-final, I think was a really, really big missed opportunity. But to have got to that stage, I think we'll look back on this summer as being quite important.
I would like to ask you about Kevin Keegan, because for me it was a really nice part of your book.
Yeah.
When you wrote about Keegan tactics or no tactics. Actually,
yeah.
He put some players like midfielder to the defense. he had completely no idea about tactics. he used to say, when you score 3 goals, we score 4 goals. Or
Yeah.
when you score 2 goals, we score 3 goals.
Yeah.
And for me, it was completely shocking.
Yeah, I mean, they just didn't work on tactics on the training ground. They just didn't do any defensive work. They didn't really talk about the formation. They basically just played five-a-side in training and then did some shooting practice at the end. And they played head tennis a lot as well, or football tennis.
But they had many talented players, like, for example, David Ginola.
Mm. Yeah, they had a great team. I mean, they bought some great players. Philippe Albert was, at the time, probably the best footballing centre-back in England. But yeah, they didn't have tactics, basically. And so it's a difficult one to write about for me because obviously the book's about tactics. And you can't really assess that Newcastle team without discussing the fact they didn't have any tactics. But also, it was revolutionary. The way they played football was incredible. They were, in England they were called the entertainers. They were the most entertaining team we'd seen, and they provided some fantastic moments. And Keegan was, Keegan took charge of Newcastle when they were towards the bottom of the second division, and they finished second in the Premier League eventually. And okay, they bought some big players, but that's a great achievement. And so I think it was important to emphasise the fact that okay, they just about lost to Manchester
Did he
United.
phone you?
No, sadly not.
after your book?
He's no, he doesn't. In fact, he's just got a book of his own coming out next week, I think, in England, which is interesting because you don't really see him anymore. You don't see he doesn't work as a pundit. He doesn't work as a journalist. I don't know anything about him for the last 5 or 6 years, but he's someone who had a big impact on English football. Later became the national team manager. Again, it didn't really work out, but the Newcastle team was maybe my favourite team in the Premier League. They challenged Manchester United and they nearly overthrew them, and they didn't quite, but they were fantastic to watch.
They are also like a second choice team for fans.
Yeah,
sometimes.
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
it was like Leicester when they were fighting for the title. Yeah,
exactly.
Like no bad connections in your mind.
Yeah, exactly.
You like the team.
And at that point as well, Manchester United were already so dominant. So whoever challenged them, whether it was Blackburn, Newcastle, Leeds briefly, Arsenal, everyone was almost against Manchester United. It was as Ferguson used to say, it's, you were for Manchester United or everyone else was against us. And that's what he used as his kind of psychological trick. But I think it was largely true. Okay.
It's the very last question. It's about managers. You have really nice team like Rio Ferdinand, Gerrard and Thierry Henry.
Mm-hmm.
If you can pick only one manager, but from this season.
From this season?
Yeah, for your team, who's gonna be?
It's a tough question. I think you have to say Guardiola, based upon what he's achieved at Barcelona and Bayern, and now in the Premier League, to get 100 points. When I started writing the book, I didn't think I'd ever be talking about someone getting 100 points. So that's an incredible achievement. But I think also Pochettino at Tottenham has done really, really well with not much money. They've probably lost more players than they've brought in, and with a lot of good young players who've come through the system, or they've been signed from championship clubs like Dele Alli. And I think his system of playing with the high pressing is maybe more of a template for what English football can be. Because in English football, we don't really produce the passing midfielders you get at Manchester City. Maybe that will change, but we produce players who play direct, they play energetic, and I think Pochettino, the way he's kind of married the pressing with the kind of quite direct attacking, as well as some possession play as well, makes him a really interesting manager. And I think I hope he'll stay at Tottenham because he's got a contract there now. And so have most of their big players. They've got big contracts, and I hope when they move to the new stadium they can kind of create a new era. But I think if he does leave, Pochettino, he will go to a really big club, whether it's Manchester United, even Barcelona maybe if they look to change their manager. So I think he
doesn't want to because he was in Espanyol.
Well, he says that. But if Barcelona come calling, I think he could be tempted. But that's for later. For now, I think he's the most up-and-coming manager. Obviously, he hasn't won anything yet, but I still think what he's achieving is really special.
What about Klopp?
And Klopp's doing a great job. It's fantastic what he's done. I think people take for granted how low Liverpool felt before he came in, and I didn't think you know, I didn't think Liverpool would be able to get Klopp because people were talking about him going to Real Madrid or a really big team. And Liverpool at that time were really struggling to get back into the Champions League places. So, you know, they missed out on the Champions League last year narrowly, but I think this year's, I think they'll struggle to compete in the Champions League and the league. But I think if they, you know, they can put together a really good challenge for the league. Haven't dropped any points so far, and yeah, they're at Tottenham tomorrow, so that's a big test.
Okay, I have like 100 questions, more questions to you, but we have to finish. So thank you for your book and for coming here. Michael Cox był moim i waszym gościem. Mam nadzieję, że spodobała wam się rozmowa i wizja futbolu przede wszystkim ze względów taktycznych, którą przedstawia nasz gość, ale przede wszystkim zachęcam was do przeczytania książki, bo w niej znajdziecie rozwinięcie tego wszystkiego. To jest tylko wierzchołek góry lodowej, a to jest chłopak, który naprawdę siedzi głęboko w taktyce. Zonal marking is this is your account.
That's my account Twitter, yeah.
On Twitter account, więc zapraszam do śledzenia tego właśnie konta twitterowego Zonal Marking, bo tam będziecie mogli przeczytać na bieżąco różne obserwacje i poglądy taktyczne Michaela. A na dzisiaj to już wszystko. Bardzo dziękuję za czas spędzony z nami. Zapraszam na kolejne produkcje. Michael, thank you once more.
Thank you very much.